So, I just found out I have been starving my boas to death. I didn't know it. But I watched a video on YouTube that said, if I'm slow growing my boas, I am starving them to death. Comes as a shock to me and my boas because, well, we thought we were doing great. Made a few babies this year. And in spite of me starving them to death. So, no, we'll talk about feeding today and about overfeeding, power feeding, slow growing, and I'll show you a whole bunch of animals at different sizes and different ages so you get an idea kind of what I'm doing. This will be all my opinion. And my opinion is based upon my experience with 40 years. So let's get into it and find out about power feeding. So I've been doing this for 40 years. So I got my first boa, Big Mama, in 1984, which makes this year my 40th year of keeping boas. I've only been breeding them for 38 years, but I've been keeping them for 40, and I've got a lot of experience. I've fed out maybe millions of rats. I don't know, a lot of rats. I've made tens of thousands of babies that are all over the world, multiple mutations. So I'm going to give you kind of my experience and what I've done and kind of the evolution of my process, how I started, and where I am today, and how I take care of my animals today, feeding-wise. And I'm trying not to use my hands too much, but I think I'm going to give up. Mamma mia! I can't stop. So my first litter of babies was born in 1986. And born to Big Mama and Big Daddy, of course. Makes perfect sense. In February of 1986. So I had 16 babies and 16 slugs. They're all in one long row along the edge of a 4 foot by 4 foot section of a 4 foot by 8 foot cage that I had divided in half. And there were 16 slugs and then 16 babies. Well, there were no books to tell you how to raise baby boas, so I had to just kind of figure it out on my own. And my camera is... So I had this litter of 16 baby boas, and I kept them all in one cage. The cage was 3 feet by about 2 feet and about 10 inches high. It was hinged with an upward hinge, or a top. It had a top opening cage, and under the cage I had a light bulb, which was not very safe. And I had cut out a hole and placed a Tupperware bowl in there for a water bowl, which was recessed like a pool. And I had all 16 babies in there. Well, they shed. I started raising some rats, and I took a bowl about that big and I put 16 fuzzy rats in it. Right? Baby boas, fuzzy rats. They have a head about that big. They could open their mouths up huge. You know, they have hinged jaw, right? So I gave them fuzzy rats, which are pretty sizable, about the size of a large adult mouse. And I just put the bowl in there, and I watched them, and they'd come over to the bowl and grab the rat and wrap it. Then another one would crawl over and grab the rat and wrap it. Another one would come over, grab the rat and wrap it. Well, I watched all of them. And it was very exciting to watch the babies eat. I'd been feeding the adults, Big Mama and Big Daddy. So I'm feeding these babies, and I continue that procedure. Well, after a while, I've seen babies eat, so I can just leave the bowl in, right? So I just bring in a bowl with my rats, and I set it in there. And I check, later on, a couple hours later, and I noticed that a couple of those boas are really, really big. And some of them are still crawling around wondering, hey, where's my rat? So some of them were eating more than one. So I had to bring in more than just 16 fuzzies. So I'd started bringing in more. I was feeding about every week, pretty much. And in 8 months, I was getting ready to move. And so in that process of moving, I was visiting my grandmother, and I decided I would measure them while I was at my grandma's. I didn't have much to do other than visit my grandma. So, we were there for about a week. So I got them to crawl straight along a wall so I could get a good measurement of them, because they would straighten out completely. And then I wrote down the size that they were, and all these babies I had an average of 43 inches. So I kind of geek out on numbers, so I've always done that. They averaged 43 inches, and the biggest one was, wait for it, Big Baby. Big Baby was 60 inches. For reals, as the kids say. 60 inches and 8 months old. Way, way too big. And the other ones averaged 43 inches. I sold all but 4 of them to Noah's Ark, a local was at the time a very large pet shop that had a nice large reptile section. And I got $35 a piece, and I thought, wow, this is fantastic. I made huge money. Of course, I'd spent more money than that buying them and buying rat feed to raise the rats, but, I felt like the hobby was helping to pay for itself at the time. This is 1986. I was a youngster, 26. So I continued to raise those boas up, and by the time they were 3 years old, Big Baby was 8 feet, and several of the other ones had caught up to her. They were huge too. And fast forward out to about 5 years, well, my babies from the first litter started to die off. I had no warning. There was nothing wrong with them. They were eating great. They were taking down 4 or 5 jumbo rats, every 10 days or every 2 weeks, right? That's how much you feed your big boas, right? That's how much I fed my big boas. And they would just die. No reason. No discernible reason that I could tell. They died. And I continued to do boas like that for probably another 10 years. I started to back off little by little and not feed as much. It was easier. They still seemed to grow fine if you only gave them 2 or 3 rats, 2 or 3 jumbo rats. And I was continuing to have these older boas, 5 to 6, 7, 8 years old. Whether I'd bred them or not, I would just find them dead for no apparent reason. Well, now I believe that is from the power feeding that I did when they were babies. And so power feeding is a threat to the life of your boas. The more mutations an animal has in it, and this is the animal right here. So the more mutations the animal has in it, the more delicate it is. So when you're raising babies, if you're raising something that has multiple mutations in it, you would be wise to raise it more slowly. And I raise everything more slowly now. So if I was in a race, some new mutation that me and 2 other guys had and nobody else had it, then, I might power feed a little bit more to a greater extent than I do. But I don't have that motivation anymore. So I'm not in a race on anything, and I don't foresee myself doing that. So I'm not going to do it. So I raise everything very slowly. And I'll give you the stats on that and how I do that. And then we'll also show you some sizes of some of these animals as we're going through this. So in particular, one mutation specifically is really delicate to being overfed, and that's the VPIT positives. Now, I'm not sure why that is, but it is. It's a fact. So for years, I've been advising people with VPIs who were starting, who didn't have a lot of experience to raise their VPI slowly, because if you pound them, you might get them big enough to breed in 2.5, 3 years. Great. You might breed them. You might make some babies. Fantastic. And when they get to be 4 or 5 years old and you've got them up to 7 feet or 8 feet, you're going to come down someday and you're going to look in that cage and that boa is going to be having gone through contortions, or it's going to be belly up. It's just going to be dead for no apparent reason, whether you bred it or not. That is the fact. So I've watched many, many keepers who were newer at it listen to this advice and then tell me that their 3 foot, 7 foot VPI is doing great. I don't know what I'm talking about. Oh, it's doing fantastic. I just bred it. She had 28 babies. I am so happy. Only to have that person contact me a year or 2 years after that and say, you were right. She died. I lost that boa. I lost all of my VPIs before they were 6 years old because I pounded them. Now I've heard that testimony many, many times. And I don't take pleasure in being right. Or I'm not gloating about that. I'm just trying to give the best advice that I could. And unfortunately, younger, less experienced herpers they're just like anything else. You know, they think they know best. They think they know better because so far everything is great. They just don't know what's going to happen long term, and they don't find out until the animals died. So I was just trying to help them avoid that eventuality. So size-wise, so here's a quick rundown on the size that I raise my boas to typically. Now sometimes I do it slower than this, and I'll get into that. But my typical animals that are a priority for me to breed at the end of 1 year, my males are about a little less than 3 feet, probably 28 to 30 inches at a year, males and females. At 18 months, over that next 6-month period, I tend to accelerate the growth on the males a little bit because I'm hoping to breed that male at 18 months, and I know that he needs to be between 3 feet and 3.5 feet to do that. So I'll feed them a little heavier, but in no case would I ever get one over about 3.5 feet at 18 months, and most of them are closer to 3 feet or 3'2". So 38 inches, 38, 39 inches at 18 months. My females typically aren't that big. I don't need them to breed at 18 months, so I'm going to raise them at kind of my normal rate. So at the end of 2 years, the males and the females, these males typically, they've gone through a breeding season. Some of them have tried to breed, some of them haven't. So they typically are going to be about 3.5 feet when they're 2 years old. Males and females. 3.5 feet. It's based on 40 years of doing this. And at 2 years, 3.5 feet, they're about the size that my first litter was at 8 months. So the greatest danger in raising these babies is that first year. So when you're feeding them, if you feed them every week, and you look at a boa, they've got a hinged jaw, so mechanically, they could swallow a much bigger meal than I would ever give them. Now, other people do give them those massive meals, and they do pound them, and they do grow them big, without regard for, or in ignorance, not knowing what eventually is likely to happen. So I don't do that anymore. But the greatest danger is that first year, and specifically even more, drilling down even better or more, the first 6 months. So if you raise them relatively slowly, the first 6 months and you don't have them massive and you're not giving them the biggest meals they can swallow, they're going to grow at a consistent, reasonable rate. When you're giving them those big meals, they're boom, 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 like you're giving them steroids, and they're just maxing out their growth potential. And muscle grows. This is just theory. Muscle and bones grow way faster than organs. This is just theory. And my theory is that on the Boas that I overfed and pounded, that their organs didn't keep up with their muscles and their bone structure. So they were not able physically to keep up with the demands that that large of a body was putting on those organs. That's my theory. That's why I don't pound anything anymore. So that first year is when there's exponential growth, regardless, even if you're taking proper care of them, and I am, at a year, and if in a year I get it up to 28, 30 inches, it's probably 5-6 times the weight. So that's 5 or 6x growth. That's a lot. So when an animal is 5 years old and it's 5 feet long, you can't make it grow 5x in a year anymore. So if it's 5 feet, it's going to weigh about 7 pounds. You can't get it to 35 pounds in a year. Even way overfeeding, you can't. But when they're a baby, you can easily get them to grow, 50 times their size in a year if you really pound them. And that is not good. They just cannot keep up with that. So at 3 years, so I'll give you the rundown. So at 18 months, I'd have my males up to about 3.5 feet, my females up to 3 feet. At 2 years, I'd have both of them, males and females, about 3.5 feet. These are animals that I'm anxious to breed. At 3 years, my males are still going to be 3.5 feet because I'm not going to feed them a lot because they're already big enough to breed. And my females are going to be 4 or 4.5 feet, so a little bigger. They're accelerating past the male size because I need to have some size on the females to make some babies. At 5 years, my typical female is between 5 and 5.5 feet. I just don't get them bigger than that in 5 years anymore. There's just no rush. I'm more interested in having successful litters from healthy females that are able to recover and breed again the subsequent year, hopefully, and then maybe the year after that. And if they don't have the weight on them, I don't even try to breed them. I have them on the same feeding schedule that all of my breeders are on. Everybody gets fed every 3 weeks, males and females. And I don't try to feed those extra meals to the ones that I'm not breeding. So everybody's on the same schedule. It's more convenient that way. By the time they're 6 years old, some of them will be reaching 6 feet. That's how I raise them. And then beyond that, they continue to grow. Boas never stop growing. So stunting. So, aren't you worried you're going to stunt your animal's growth? Well, I've done this a lot of times that I've produced babies. I kept the ones that I wanted. And because I had other priorities and other animals were more important for me to raise up and breed, I've had, 4 or 5 females from a specific litter, Washington bloodline, that I bred the first time. I believe it was in 1998 or something like that, a long time ago, maybe 96. But I had a number of females that I kept that I really liked, I really wanted, and I wanted to breed them, but I wasn't in a mad rush to breed them. So by the time they were 5 years old, was I starving them? By the time they were 5 years old, they were 3 to 3.5 feet. 3 to 3.5 feet. Was I starving them? No. Did I stunt them? people don't understand what the word stunt means relative to reptiles. The beautiful thing about being a reptile is if you're in the wild and you have a really bad year for food availability, and you normally might eat, say you'd eat 15 meals a year, you know, on a good fat year when the year is going good. And then you hit a year where there's not a lot of mice around, not a lot of birds to be gotten. It's a real dry year for whatever reason. You only get 3 meals. Are you stunted? No. No, you're fine. That's the beauty of being a reptile. You don't lose a lot of weight. You waste your fat stores, and at the end of that year, you're probably fine. You're probably no problem. If you've managed to avoid predators, you're probably fine. You don't have to have a ton to eat. It's a little different with colubrids because they have a really fast metabolism, but you get the point. So boas can go a long time without meals. Now my boas, the Washington bloodline females that I raised to be 5 years old and were 3 or 3.5 feet, they didn't eat just 3 meals a year. You know, they fed about 12 times a year. I fed them about once a month. I just got a much smaller meal. So a meal that I knew they wouldn't grow off of, but they would maintain. So I was just maintaining their size, which is perfectly healthy for boas. I mean, perfectly better than pounding them. Way better than pounding them healthy. So when they were 3.5 years, 3 to 3.5 feet, when they got to be 5 years old, I decided I want to breed them year after next. So I started feeding them hard. And I got them, in 2 years, I got them up to 5 or 5.5 feet, which is kind of my more reasonable growth rate. But I got them up to 5 or 5.5 feet. And then I started to breed them. And I made buku babies with those 4 females. And they were none the wiser for having been raised so slowly, having been starved to death, which they weren't. Now that's a lot slower growth than anything that I raised in the last number of years has been, because if it's not a priority, if the animal is not a high enough priority that I'm going to want to breed it in 4 or 5 years, then I'm probably not going to keep it, because I just have too many animals. But the point that I'm trying to make is boa constrictors are not stunted. You could technically, absolutely starve an animal to death. That would not be good. But you're not stunting them by growing them very slowly. They're not. It's not like it's not like mammals, I should say. So humans grow from the time they're born until they're 18 or 19, and then they're done growing, and that's locked in. You have no choice. You cannot raise a human, cannot slow grow a human, and decide to raise it to be an adult by the time it's 40. That isn't a thing. So if you don't feed and you don't nourish a human enough, you will get stunting that they won't recover from. They may recover and have some level of health, but they will be impacted by it. So a human being can grow up to be smaller than it would have been if it's been stunted. Reptiles, same thing. They're not going to get as big as they could get, but they're going to be perfectly healthy. One thing I noticed with them is they end up getting a larger head. The head continues to grow kind of at a little higher rate than the rest of the body if you raise them really slowly, and so do the eyes. So they have bigger eyes. Now, anybody who's gotten wild-caught boas in that had size on them, what is something unique about those boas from any of your captive-born boas, captive-raised boas? Oh, I just gave you a big hint. They always have a really big head. Always. You've heard people comment about, oh, its head was as big as a football. Well, that's because of that slow grow process that they engaged in the wild. And they have very big eyes as well. this is universal with older, larger, wild-caught boas, because they're all slow grown in the wild, because food isn't necessarily available like it is in a plastic box in a cage where you've got a freezer full of frozen rats. It's a completely different process. So I'd just like to put to rest this idea of stunting. When someone's got an animal for sale and it's something genetically that I want, and say somebody's got a VPI, and this is literal, this has happened to me. Someone's got a VPI, female, male, doesn't matter, and it's 6 feet. Oh, it's a beauty. Take a look at this. And I ask, how old is it? 2. I ain't buying that animal, because that animal is going to be dead in a couple of years. I am not going to buy it. If it's not a VPI and it's just any other mutation and it's 6 feet long and it's 2 years old, I'm not buying it, male or female, because that animal's days are numbered. The person that kept it has accelerated the growth to such an extent that it is going to die at a younger age. There's nothing you can do about it. You can keep it from getting any worse by backing off on what you feed them, but you can't heal that process that had already been set in motion by the person who'd overfed them from the beginning. So if someone has a VPI and it's 3 feet long and it's 5 years old, male or female, and it's something genetically that I would use, I wouldn't hesitate to buy it. Wouldn't hesitate. If it wasn't VPI, it was anything else. I mean, VPI in particular, because they're particularly sensitive to this power feeding, I think. Say it was a call albino or sharp or whatever, something fire, and it's 6 feet long and 2 years old, I don't want it. If it's 5, 6 years old and it's only 3 feet, 3.5 feet, you bet I want it. You bet I want it. That size doesn't scare me a bit, because I know that I can start feeding it when I get it. And I would rather obtain an animal that's never been bred or never been raised to adult size to an animal that someone else has raised to adult size. The other danger in buying an adult size animal is you never know 100% for sure what age it is. And I like to know the age. So if something is, 6 feet and they tell me it's 8 years old, well, that's great if it really is 8 years old. So I think I've beaten that to death. So I like animals that are raised slow, and I prefer animals that are smaller, and this is exactly the way I do it. Now, if your boa is a year old and it's 4 feet long, you have been power feeding it. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. You have been power feeding it. Oh no, I never power feeded. Just because in your little head, you think in your little head's definition for what power feeding must be is different. Say you think that if you have to feed it like a Burmese python to be power feeding it. Boas aren't air plants. It can't grow to be 4 feet unless you fed it a lot of food. They're not air plants. They don't just grow for no reason. You don't walk by the cage, hi boa, clean the cage, and the boa grows. You walk by the cage, you throw in a large rat, and the boa grows. Oh, well, they're not that big a rat, and I only feed every 4 days. If your boa is 2 years old and it's 5 feet, you are power feeding your boa. This is based upon 40 years experience of doing this and observation. I don't have to see the size meals you're giving the animal. I don't have to hear the frequency that you're feeding them at. If it's 2 years old and it's 5 feet long, it doesn't matter what the animal's genetics are. It can't get to be 5 feet without being fed 5 feet worth of rats to get it in 2 years, to get it that size in 2 years. If your animal's 3 years old and it's 6 feet long, you have been power feeding your animal. If your animal's 4 years old and it's 7 feet long, or forbid, 8 feet long, you're power feeding that puppy. You are power feeding that puppy. Any animal that's power fed is not going to live as long as it would if it wasn't power fed. I know, yours is 4 years old and it's 8 feet and oh, she is so healthy. She's doing so great. I know, I was that guy. But in a year or 2 or 3, that animal's going to just turn up belly up for no reason, or she's going to stop eating and she's going to go downhill and she's going to die. And there's no changing that. So based upon my experience, and I didn't mean to sound, I'm not trying to sound mean or annoying. I'm just telling you, based on my experience, if your animals are that size, in those few years, you're power feeding that animal, and you're running a risk of the animal dying early as a result. If the animal was 5 years old and it was 4 feet long and fed consistently and raised to 4 feet in 5 years, you have a recipe for having an animal that's going to live 20 years plus. Not so if it's 8 feet long. I know. There's exceptions to every rule, of course. Everyone's got an experience that is different from what I'm telling you. But what I'm telling you is after raising hundreds of boas in general, these are truths that you need to accept. So that's my experience, my opinion. You can comment below. Tell me how wrong I am. I know I am. But I'm going to show you a whole bunch of boas now. Give you an example of the size of some of these boas at various ages. So you see kind of what I've done and what size I've gotten them to, what size they are today. And I hope this helps. Hope this helps some people. And let me know what you think. Subscribe, recommend this to your friends. Post it on Facebook, everywhere you can. And I appreciate it. So stay tuned for more boas coming up right now. All right. So you knew it was going to be a labyrinth, right? So this is a hypo-labyrinth female. She's very excited. This is a 2-year-old hypo-labyrinth female. And she is head sharp. This is the size they are for me by the time I raised it to be 2.5 years old. So she's not very big. She's less than 4 feet. She's about 3.5 feet. And 2 years old. So now I'm going to get a male. Alright, so now this is an albino male labyrinth boa. The first one, 2 years old, and a male. And he was born in 2021. He sired a litter this year, proved to be het anarthristic. And he's looking at me like, are you a rat or are you my grandpa? So that's a male at 2 years of age, just a little guy, and he will do everything that a 6-foot male will do, except that he's labyrinth and het anarthristic, in addition to being a sharp albino. So he does have some things that a lot of other males can't do. All right, this is a 3-year-old Key West labyrinth boa. You sense a theme going on here? So this is a 3-year-old Key West labyrinth boa, and this is the typical size that I would have a male or a female at this age. At 3 years of age. So this male, he's probably getting close to 4 feet. That's pretty much as big as I'll ever get a male. About 4 feet. So that's the size they are. VPIs I get a little smaller than this. Probably be 3 to 3.5 feet at this age. just because I want them to live as long as possible. So that's the size it is. This is a 4-year-old not Key West, but Call IMG Sunglow, and that's about the size that I have my females typically. It's about 4.5 feet. She'll be a little bit bigger by the time breeding season comes along. I'm not going to breed her yet, but that's about the size that I would have a female that was 4 years old. This is a 6-year-old VPI female, and that's about the size I would have one of those. She's probably a little over 5 feet, so this is about the size that I would have about a 5-year-old regular Colombian. This one's VPI, so she's a little bit smaller. Let me see if I stand back if you can tell a little better. So there's about a 5-foot female, and she's a 6-year-old VPI, and she's as big as she needs to be for that size for 6 years. She's a beauty too, isn't she? She's a little bit excited. So now I want to get a big boa out just for fun. I don't know if I'll be able to or not. She's not the most friendly girl on the planet, but this is a hypo, a double het Call Sunglow from the very early years when they were made. So this one is about a 2005 animal, so she's 18 years old. So when I get her out and I'm holding her, I'm probably not going to be able to talk very much about it because I'll be a little bit preoccupied with making sure that she doesn't fall or I don't do anything wrong, because I don't put them around my neck. Just not a great idea. So I'm going to get her now. We'll take a look at her, and hopefully we'll be able to get a good look at her. This is an 18-year-old female, so I do get some of them really big, and I've only bred this one twice. One time successfully, one time with slugs. The first time I bred her successfully was when she was about 6 or 7 years old and about 6 feet. And then the last time that I bred her was like 2 years ago, and she had slugs. So they don't always breed every year. But anyways, we'll get that animal next. Hopefully. Alright, this is currently my biggest boa. So you get an idea. So this one's 18 years old. It's my oldest female right now. I have raised them older than this, but this is the oldest one I have right now. She wants to go someplace else. Doesn't want to be held. I think she's about 9 feet. Big girl, and I'm going to put her back. And this is currently my oldest boa. This is a male. This is a monster tail hypo. This animal was born, I don't know if he was in the first litter or the second litter. I can't remember. But the first litter of monster tail hypos happened in 2000. The second litter happened in 2002. So he is either 21 years old or 23 years old. And he's doing fine. He's a male. And he's probably 4.5 feet. Maybe getting close to 5. But I try to keep him small. This male will do everything I need a male to do at this size. So there's no reason for him to get any bigger. They invariably, they do grow some. But, so this is one of those really, really early monsters. Like it. Okay, I realized I hadn't shown a yearling. So this is a yearling. This is a Hypo Labby Het Carbon. And this one's about 14 months old. This is a male. I fully intend to breed this animal. I just have to get a little bit more size on him, maybe 3 more inches, and he'll be big enough to breed. Not sure what I'm going to breed him with, but that's kind of typical for a yearling, 14 or 15 months old. Give you an idea of that. Then I'll show you one more boa, a bonus boa, one just for fun. And just for fun, this is a male crystal boa from the first litter of crystals. So I should remember he's at least 5 years old, maybe 6. It's a male crystal because he's a crystal. He's gotten a little more food than most males would get. Proven, I've bred him twice, so he's proven twice. Anyways, that's a male crystal. Hope you enjoyed the video. Like it and comment. Be a big help. Appreciate you watching. Great fun. I lied. One more boa. IMG VPI Nexus, head anarthristic, male, 5 years old. Handsome little guy. Didn't make any babies this year, though. Shame on him. Maybe next year.